Well, I came to Persian through the Persian language, actually, not realizing that I would become so immersed in Indo-Persian culture. But I guess in the end, you always come back to who you are. It deals with questions of identity and origin. So when I began studying Persian literature, I wanted to study the Persian literature of Iran, where the modern Persian, and I had studied Persian not in India but with Iranian teachers in the U.S. and in Iran, so that that was my orientation, and to study Firdausi and Hafiz, and modern poets such as Sohrab Sipehri and Farrukh Farrukhzad, whom I loved greatly and studied. But then, in a roundabout way, I came to Indo-Persian. One reason was that my advisor was the one who advised me to write a thesis on Masood Saad Salman, partly because it hadn't been done, and partly now I think, although he never said it, this was Professor Hishmat Moayed at the University of Chicago, because he thought I would be able to do justice to it in a way that that someone who didn't come from a South Asian background would not be able to see certain things. So that was my first major project on Masood Saad Salman and the earliest phase of Indo-Persian literature and culture in the subcontinent, how it came to be transplanted here first as just a frontier of the central Persian world, an outpost of Ghazni, which was an important cultural center, and then came into its own when it's shifted to Delhi, and the rest. Delhi always maintained its place as a center of Indo-Persian culture right from the beginning. So after Masood Saad Salman, we have a gap in our knowledge of Indo-Persian culture and literature, probably because not much textual evidence is available. There was a lot of destruction of works in that period all over the Persian world because of the Mongol conquests, etc. So that we kind of jump ahead to the world of Amir Khusro, slightly before him, but mainly the period of Amir Khusro, when we again get a sense of what a vibrant culture, literary culture there was for Indo-Persian, and this continues again till about the 14th century, and then we have more gaps till the Mughal period. Of course, there are individuals we know who wrote poetry, and we have names of poets and Sufis who wrote in Persian. But our understanding of an entire kind of a literary culture, how a poet or a group of poets functioned under patronage of a certain court, under certain rulers, their relationship to society, what they took from society, and then what they put in their Persian writings, and how that they reflected on that society, their dealings with Sufis, etc. Is Amir Khusro's period is the richest, as you know. I devoted attention to that period because it's only now that actually I'm starting to understand that you cannot do any serious work or research on Indo-Persian culture of any period, whether it's 19th century Ghalib's Delhi or the Mughal court of the 16th or 17th centuries, without an understanding of Amir Khusro's world. My work on Khusro although my engagement has been very kind of sincere and unceasing, I have only skimmed the surface because, as you know, I've done one very general introduction to Khusro's life and works, and then a volume on translations with Paul Lozensky, which we try to present to readers in English, the whole variety of Khusro's writings, whether the Persian writings which we know from the manuscript edition that can be definitely attributed to him, to the Hindvi, his Hindvi writings, which are more tenuously kind of attributed to him, but definitely part of the world of Khusro. As I've worked, my current interest has been on the literature, court literature of the Mughal period, especially of the 16th and 17th centuries, the court poets who were mostly Iranian poets at the court of Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, but of course very important poets of Indian origin of this time too, such as Faizi, Munir Lahori of Shah Jahan's time, who were very, very important in the formation of Mughal Persian literary culture. But I'm amazed to see when now that I'm doing this work, how the presence and legacy of Amir Khusro's writings, and not just his writings, but his personality pervades their works and thought, that they are very much aware in the, at the Mughal court of Amir Khusro's presence, and one would say in the formation of Indo-Persian culture. So as the Mughals are trying to form a distinctive kind of society, a Mughal society, which is multilingual, which is rich in many ways, they are very conscious that somebody named Amir Khusro a few centuries before them had already tried to do this in his writings. And what is amazing, that Amir Khusro was an individual, whereas the Mughals, there were many people involved in this project, and yet his presence is there. It looms over everything in this period, from the writings of Tazkiras, what we call biographical dictionaries, which are much more than Tazkiras are much more than biographical dictionaries. They are a repository of anecdotes, of lives of people. They are anthologies of poetry. There's literary criticism in them. They tell us how people viewed the past and the present poets, what standards they applied in liking certain verses and choosing to record them. And in this you find that Amir Khusro's presence is very central, both in the description of Delhi, because a lot of biographical dictionaries were arranged by place, so that you have poets of a certain place, so that if you talk about poets of Delhi, you will definitely you begin with Amir Khusro. His biography is constantly being shaped in the Tazkiras of the 16th, 17th, and even the 18th centuries, so that we see an evolution of the lives of these poets, Khusro and others, how they are filtered through Tazkiras over time. If we didn't have these accounts in the Tazkiras, and we only had the works themselves, the original poems themselves, then our knowledge of the literary culture would be a lot poorer. The tazkiras are essential to understanding the development and transformation of Indo-Persian literature and culture, and it is now that students and scholars of this area have started to realize the importance of the tazkira as a source for so many things, and a lot of good work is being done on them. And yet we have a lot of tazkiras that have still not been published, especially the later ones, because especially in the 18th and 19th centuries there was a proliferation of these biographical dictionaries. They became more local, so they were written for whether for poets or notables or ulama of different places. You have tazkiras of women poets, or you have tazkiras of Hindu poets writing in Persian, for instance, so that you have, instead of trying to grasp the entirety of the tradition, whether the Persian or Indo-Persian tradition, as the earlier poets could do, by this period, the 18th, 19th centuries, it was impossible to do that. No tazkira could encompass the entire tradition, so that you get these very specialized ones being written. And amazingly, that in the 20th century, and I would say even in the 21st century, a lot of books that, whether in Urdu or Persian or English even, that introduce a literary culture, they take the form of tazkiras. You find that you have chapters on poets and then quotations of their poetry. This is really the model of the tazkira, but it lives on in many different ways in our times as well. And it's a very useful model. We don't have to see the tazkira as merely being kind of recording and noting the poems and anecdotes of their times. They very much are a reflection of how this poetry was being performed, how it was viewed, how it was being judged by critics, and which poets were thought to be important, which poets were thought to be Indo-Persian, for instance. There was a consciousness at a certain point of an Indo-Persian tradition in which Masood Sa'd, Salman, Khusro, Hassan, Dehelvi, and other poets like that, Faizi, they become part of a tradition which is part of a larger Persian tradition, but there is a consciousness of this kind of specialized tradition that is distinctive to the subcontinent. Apart from my interest in Indo-Persian poetry in its entire kind of, the longue durée, the 1,000-year-old tradition, I have had scholarly interest in travel writing and the Safarnama, especially those written by women from the early modern to the modern period, and so far I have published on the writings of the amazing Faizi sisters, Atiya Nazli and Zohra Faizi, all of whom who were very important in the Urdu literary scene of Bombay, which is very unusual, of the late 19th and early 20th century. But I've also gone back to look at the writings of travel, what you could call safarnamas by women in the early modern period. There is a work in Masnavi form by a Safavid woman who's only known as the widow of Mirza Khalil. We don't even know what her name was, but she wrote a safarnama to Mecca, a Hajj pilgrimage, a narrative, which is very an important work of the Safavid period. This has been published in Persian, but I'm translating it into English as part of our project that I'm doing on women travelers and their writings. And then, of course, the writings of Princess Jahanara Begum, Shah Jahan's daughter, who you wouldn't call them exactly safarnamas, but in her writings she has descriptions of visits, one to the a pilgrimage to the Ajmer shrine, which is a mini travelogue, or you could say a pilgrimage narrative, and a wonderful piece that has been translated and published. It's been translated by Karl Ernst, and I am translating it. It's a part of the entire works of Jahanara, because she wrote a couple of treatises. But in another work, Jahanara Begum talks about her visit to Kashmir to visit Mullah Shah, who was the Sufi, Qadiri Sufi, who was resident in Srinagar and who was very much a very important figure for both Dara Shikoh and Jahanara Begum. Jahanara Begum and Dara Shikoh were devotees of Mullah Shah, and they had built a mosque and a complex for him. There several buildings survive, the Akhund Mullah Shah Masjid, and perhaps the Pari Mahal, the amazing architectural complex was built for him. So that has been an interest, and Kashmir has been an interest of mine, because it played a very important role in in the formation of Indo-Persian culture, but specifically in a very, what I said earlier, in a local kind of Persianate manifestation, so that you have Indo-Persian culture in Gujarat and Bengal, Punjab, Sindh, the Deccan, and Kashmir, and each one has its, it's a very distinctive identity, and Indo-Persian Kashmir and Indo-Persian culture in Kashmir is very distinctive, and I've been studying, especially in the 17th century, how that the topography of Kashmir especially figures like the Sufi master Mullah Shah and others, and the governor Zafar Khan, they together, obviously they didn't work consciously together, but how a very distinctive form of Indo-Persian culture came together and expressed itself in the 17th century because of such figures like Mullah Shah, Zafar Khan, Dara Shikoh, Jahanara Begum, and Shah Jahan, and his court poets. So that has been an interest of mine.
Persian manuscripts are a source of historiography, writing of history. Do you think the literature that we have in Persian in India, has it been taken seriously by the historian? Has it been used properly, or still a lot of work needs to be done? Because without knowing the Persian, you can't really write the history of medieval.
Absolutely. I mean, we should make Persian a compulsory subject in schools, because more than any other language, to understand our history, we need to know Persian. It is being taken seriously. I think we live in a time where there is a great deal of enthusiasm about Indo-Persian sources, not just in India or by Indians or by South Asianists, but around the world, in Iran, in Europe and North America. There is a great deal of interest in understanding the extent of Persian learning in the subcontinent, not just previously there was more of an interest in poetry and chronicles, but now there is an interest in learning in how many different ways this kind of Persian learning and culture was transmitted over the centuries. So there are various projects going on around the world, the Perso-Indica, the Persianate Society Association, the kind of publishing of text that is being done by the Iran Culture House here, by the Institute in Aligarh, by scholars at Delhi University, is staggering. This was not happening even in my short career. When I began 20 years ago, it was a very different world. When I began studying Indo-Persian literature, basically it was Anna Marie Schimmel and her writings. She was a great inspiration for a whole generation of scholars, but we have gone way beyond that now. We have historians, we have art historians who really know Persian and who study Indo-Persian culture through its visual manifestation in painting or architecture. We have disciplinary boundaries have been erased so that people who study history, whether Sultanate history or Mughal history or colonial history, they are studying Persian, but they look at literary texts seriously. We have people who study literature looking at other kinds of texts, historical texts, inscriptions, biographical dictionaries, etc. So it's a very exciting period as well, and we have scholars who are studying multilinguality in different periods in the subcontinent. Francesca Orsini has led this kind of project, but there are others as well looking at multilingual Bengal, multilingual Gujarat or Punjab, and this is, I think, this will become, even I think much more so an exciting field in the future, as more manuscripts are published, as sources are uncovered, and as students are being trained. But this is where I think the real challenge lies in training students, because it's one thing for students to acquire a knowledge of Persian and Indo-Persian sources to use in their work, and they come up with wonderful books and studies, but we have to ensure that this knowledge is passed on so that you can scholars can work on a number of areas, history and art history, etc. But in the end, you go back to the study of languages and training in philology and manuscripts, so that that we have to ensure that this kind of training is passed on to future generations, and this can only be done through the publication of texts. As you know, I'm involved in the MCLI, the Murthy Classical Library of India, and they pay serious attention to Indo-Persian texts. But that is one way to ensure that that this knowledge is passed on, and interest is generated among young people, among people who wouldn't think that Persian was important for their worlds, but they would be surprised. Persian is important for a great many fields in South Asian studies.